Back to one of our top stories now, the Bank of Canada's interest rate decision. The central bank has decided to hold its key rate. So for more on this, we've reached economist Armine Yalnizyan in Ottawa. Thank you for making time for us again.
My pleasure.
Okay, so this decision, not a big surprise here, but what do you make of it to not raise the interest rate and just take a pause for a moment?
Well, we were signaled that that was going to be the case last announcement. And of course, when you see growth rates of 0%, which is the last print we saw in terms of GDP growth from Statistics Canada, now's not the time to pull the trigger higher. If you are aiming for that soft landing they've been talking about all along. You don't want to contract the economy any more than you have to. But we have had now a lot of saber rattling from south of the border. Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, has been talking about the need to push rates higher. And now the Bank of Canada governor has got a real problem on their hands in that they can't get too far out of lockstep with what the Americans do, because otherwise we pay more more for everything we import, as the discrepancy between where the capital flows and how the dollar's exchange values change.
So then, Armine, where do you believe things might go with this balancing act, as you've described? You don't want the economy and growth to continue to shrink and to entirely stall, but at the same time, you do have to balance that with what we're seeing with, of course, our largest trading partner, with what's happening south of the border. So how long do you anticipate this pause might last?
I think it entirely depends on how the Fed behaves. But there's a secondary thing that's going on, Arthi, which is really interesting, that all over the world there are central bankers, including in the United States, saying, hey, maybe this isn't the cure for what ails us in terms of inflation. In fact, today's note made kind of a comment on one of the reasons why inflation is moderating is because energy prices fell. Central banks raising rates had nothing to do with that. The other thing they mentioned is that the cost of food and shelter is incredibly high. Central banks raising rates will have nothing to do with her food costs by and large, but they will affect the biggest line item in anybody's budget, rich or poor, which is housing costs. So there is a good deal of humility. In fact, I think the word humility was used in the last rate announcement. We'll see how they describe it this afternoon, but there is some kind of rethinking about what the role of the central bank is in dealing with this wave of inflation, which is unlike previous waves of inflation, unlike anything we've seen since maybe the turn of the last century, when there was also a pandemic and also a war and also labor shortages. So we are dealing with a very unusual moment, and central banks aren't the only players in town. And we might be actually witnessing the beginning of a handoff, not a handoff, but a rebalancing between fiscal and monetary policy if everybody acts like grown-ups.
So then, Armine, do you think the consumer price index can be reined in to the 2% target by 2024 that we had previously heard outlined by the Bank of Canada governor?
Excellent question, Arthi. And in fact, that is a question I myself have posed to the Bank of Canada governor, asking, the period in which we used central bank policy to tame inflation was also a period of China becoming the cheap wage factory of the world. It was also a period where global supply chains became the most efficient they had ever been. It was also a period of massive labor surpluses because the baby boomers in the 1990s were more unemployed than ever before because of two back-to-back recessions, and there were more baby boomers, including me, in the labor market than we had ever seen before. So here we have exactly a reversal of all those causes of lower prices. It is often said, and said often by the Bank of Canada governor, that this is the plan and the plan always works. But in fact, the plan had a lot of tailwinds, and now it's facing a lot of headwinds. I can't see us getting back to 2% unless there is some major technological changes, unless there is some kind of major disaster where we are flooding labor markets everywhere with newcomers because of climate change, because of wars. You can't read into the future, but if things go the way they are now, I can't see us getting back to a 2% target anytime soon.
And one final question for you in terms of what people can do to sort of counter what we're seeing happening in the economy. No question, there are very few people who are left unscathed by these actions and by, of course, what we're seeing with inflation and those interest rate hikes. So what's your advice?
Oh, gee, I don't think this is an individual what can you do thing. I think this is a question of what are we doing together. And central banks are, we need them and they are there to stabilize prices, but we also need our governments to act to take the sting out of inflation for the people that are getting the most beaten up. And here, you know, inflation has also caused record profits in several sectors, in banking, in groceries, in energy sectors. The list goes on, and we're not taxing those excess revenues, the ones that are pure windfall from what has happened in the last few months, and recycling those revenues to help those who are losing their homes, who are going hungry. Those numbers are growing, and we need to do more.